Every man carries ghosts from his past, and some spend their lives running from them. For aging cowboy Silas McGraw, the desert has been his refuge for decades. In 1887, Silas roams the landscape with his loyal dog Boone, no longer the feared gunhand he once was. When they find a saguaro cactus with a strange lump, something tells him to cut it open. Inside, he discovers a blood-stained journal, the final confession of a dying lawman that reveals a betrayal Silas thought buried forever. The journal contains names he hasn't heard in years and secrets that could destroy everything he's tried to forget. But what happens when a man who spent his life running finally decides to ride back and face the truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly before Silas McGraw, like a canvas painted in shades of amber and rust. At 58, his weathered face told stories of countless sunrises witnessed from horseback, each line earned through years of solitude and contemplation. His graying beard, neatly trimmed despite his isolation, framed eyes that had seen too much violence and found peace only in the vastness of this unforgiving land. Boone, his blue heeler mix, padded silently beside his horse's hooves, ears alert to every sound the desert offered. The dog had been with him for 7 years now, since Silas found him as a pup near a dried creek bed, half dead from thirst and abandonment. They understood each other in the way that only comes from shared hardship and mutual dependence. Neither asked questions the other couldn't answer. Their camp lay nestled in a canyon where ancient peoples had once carved symbols into red rock walls. Silas had chosen this place not for its protection from the elements, but for the sense of continuity it provided. Men had sought refuge here for countless generations, each leaving their mark before moving on. He felt connected to that endless procession of souls, searching for something they couldn't name. The morning routine never varied. Coffee brewed over a small fire while Boone explored the perimeter, checking for coyote tracks or the droppings of desert sheep. Silas would study the horizon, reading the sky like scripture, predicting the day's weather from the color of distant mountains and the behavior of high clouds. Such skills had kept him alive during his younger years, when survival meant staying one step ahead of those who wanted him dead. He rarely thought about those days anymore. The name Silas McGraw had once been whispered in saloons from Tucson to El Paso, spoken with equal parts fear and respect. His gun hand had been swift and sure, settling disputes that words couldn't resolve. But that man felt like a stranger. Now, someone he'd known in passing, rather than inhabited for 30 years. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began with a child's cry echoing through a dusty street in Perido Springs, the sound piercing through gunsmoke to reach whatever remained of his humanity. A stray bullet, his bullet, had found an innocent bystander, a young mother carrying groceries home to her family. She lived, but the terror in her eyes haunted him more than any of the deliberately chosen targets he'd faced down. That night, he'd ridden out of Perido Springs for what he thought would be the last time, leaving behind everything that connected him to his former life. His reputation, his friends, and most painfully, Maria Delgado, the woman who'd seen past his reputation to the man he might become. She'd begged him to stay, to find another way to live, but he knew the cycle of violence would continue as long as he remained. Someone would always challenge the fastest gun, and he would always have to prove his skill or die trying. The desert had accepted him without judgment. Here, among the saguaros and barrel cacti, his past meant nothing. Survival depended on understanding the land, respecting its rhythms, and adapting to its harsh mercy. He learned to find water where others saw only stone, to read animal tracks like newspapers, and to move through the landscape without disturbing its ancient peace. His horse, a sturdy Mustang named Cisco, had been his companion for 12 years. The animal possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate treacherous terrain and sense danger before it materialized. Together, they'd mapped every canyon, spring, and hidden valley within 100 miles of their base camp. Silas knew this land as intimately as a man knows his own hands. The work he did now bore little resemblance to his former profession. He guided lost travelers back to established trails, helped ranchers locate missing livestock, and occasionally delivered messages between isolated settlements. Payment came in the form of coffee, tobacco, or simple gratitude. He needed little and wanted less. Boone's sharp bark brought him back to the present moment. The dog stood rigid beside a flowering Palo Verde tree, nose pointed toward something that had captured his attention. Silas dismounted and followed the dog's gaze to where wagon tracks crossed their path, deep ruts pressed into the hard-packed earth by heavily loaded wheels. The tracks were recent, perhaps 2 days old, heading southeast toward the border. Something about their depth and spacing troubled him. No legitimate freight hauler would risk this route with such a heavy load, not with Apache bands still ranging through the mountains. This track spoke of desperate men making dangerous choices. He knelt beside the clearest impression, measuring its width with his fingers and noting how the metal rim had bitten into a buried stone. The wagon had been overloaded, probably carrying more weight than its axles were designed to bear. Whoever drove it was either very brave or very foolish, possibly both. "What do you think, Boone?" he asked quietly. "Should we follow and see? If they need help?" The dog whined softly, a sound Silas had learned to interpret as unease. Boone possessed instincts honed by generations of survival, and his warnings had saved them both on numerous occasions. If the dog sensed something wrong about these tracks, Silas would trust that judgment. They continued their intended route, but Silas found himself glancing back toward the wagon trail several times. The responsible thing would be to report it to Marshal Davidson in Yuma when he next visited town for supplies. Let the law handle whatever business had motivated someone to risk the desert crossing with such a load. The day grew hotter as they climbed toward a ridge that offered views across miles of untouched wilderness. From this vantage point, Silas could see the smoke of distant settlements, thin gray columns rising straight up in the still air. Somewhere out there, people were living normal lives, working ordinary jobs, raising families and planning futures. The sight of that smoke always stirred conflicting emotions, nostalgia for a life he'd never quite managed to embrace, and relief at having found his own path through the wilderness. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding thermals with effortless grace. Silas watched its patient hunt, admiring the precision with which it read the landscape below. Like him, the hawk had learned to survive by observing, waiting, and choosing its moments carefully. Unlike him, it felt no regret about its nature. The saguaro that would change everything stood apart from its companions, noticeably larger and older than the surrounding cacti. Silas estimated it at over 200 years old, its massive arms reaching skyward like a cathedral's spires. Something about its base caught his attention, an irregular swelling that didn't match the plant's natural growth pattern. Boone approached the cactus cautiously, hackles raised and nose twitching. The dog circled the base twice before sitting down and looking back at Silas, with an expression that clearly communicated concern. Whatever had created that bulge didn't belong in the natural order of things. Silas dismounted and studied the swelling more carefully. The cactus's flesh had grown around something solid, incorporating it into the plant's structure over many years. Native peoples sometimes buried sacred objects at the bases of particularly old saguaros, believing the spirits of the cacti would protect them. But this looked different. More accidental than intentional. He pulled his knife from its sheath, testing the blade's sharpness against his thumb. The steel was well maintained, honed to a fine edge through years of careful attention. Whatever lay hidden in the cactus had waited this long. He could afford to work slowly and deliberately. The first cut revealed the plant's inner structure, layers of fibrous material arranged in a complex pattern that spoke to decades of patient growth. Silas worked carefully, following the contours of the foreign object, trying to minimize damage to the ancient plant. Boone watched intently, occasionally whining when the work took Silas closer to whatever had triggered the dog's unease. As he cut deeper, his knife struck something that wasn't plant matter, something wrapped in oiled leather, preserved by the cactus's protective embrace and the desert's dry climate. His heart began to beat faster as he widened the opening, creating space to extract whatever had been hidden here for so many years. The package emerged slowly, like a reluctant secret finally ready to reveal itself. Silas brushed away bits of plant material and studied the wrapping, recognizing the careful way the leather had been folded and tied. This was the work of someone who understood the desert's preserving properties, someone who'd intended for this package to survive whatever time and weather might bring. He looked around the empty landscape, suddenly aware that he was about to cross a threshold from which there might be no return. The desert had given him 20 years of peace, asking nothing more than respect for its harsh beauty. This discovery threatened to drag him back into a world he'd deliberately abandoned. But curiosity proved stronger than caution. With steady hands, he began to untie the leather cords that had protected this secret for longer than he cared to imagine. The leather came away like old skin, revealing layers of oiled cloth wrapped around something rectangular and solid. Silas's hands moved with unconscious reverence, as if he were handling something sacred rather than merely curious. Boone pressed closer, his warm body providing comfort against the sudden chill that seemed to emanate from the package, despite the desert heat. Beneath the final layer of wrapping lay a bound journal, its leather cover stained dark with what could only be blood. The stains had dried to a rust-brown color, but their pattern suggested violence. Not the neat spots that might come from a minor injury, but the desperate splashes of someone fighting for their life. Silas turned the journal over, in his hands, noting the careful stitching that held the binding together and the quality of the leather itself. This was no ordinary ledger or diary, but something crafted to last, made by someone who valued permanence over convenience. A brass clasp held it closed, tarnished green with age but still functional. When he opened the cover, the first page nearly stopped his heart. Written in a careful hand, now faded but still legible, were the words, "The true account of Deputy United States Marshal Thomas McGraw, written in the event of my death, year of our Lord, 1867, Thomas McGraw." His younger brother dead these 20 years. Silas sank to the ground beside the cactus, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. Boone whined and pressed against his side, sensing the emotional earthquake that had just shattered his master's carefully constructed piece. The journal felt impossibly heavy in his hands, as if it contained not just words, but all the weight of the past he'd tried so hard to escape. Thomas had been everything Silas was not: idealistic, law-abiding, convinced that justice could triumph over chaos if good men stood firm against evil. He'd pinned on a deputy's badge at 22, full of righteous purpose and unshakable faith in the system. Silas had tried to warn him that the law was just another kind of gun, no more moral than the men who wielded it. But Thomas wouldn't listen. The last time they'd spoken, harsh words had passed between them. Thomas had accused Silas of choosing the easy path, selling his skills to whoever paid the most, without regard for right or wrong. Silas had responded with brutal honesty. But what the law really meant on the frontier: politics, money, and power dressed up in the language of justice. They'd parted in anger, and Silas had been too proud to bridge the gap before it became a canyon. Now, 20 years later, he held his brother's final words in hands that trembled despite his efforts to remain steady. The desert wind whispered through the cacti around him, but the sound seemed distant and unreal, as if he existed in a bubble of suspended time. He turned the page and began to read. If these words are ever found, know that I write them with my life bleeding away into the sand, shot down by men I trusted. The corruption runs deeper than I ever imagined, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. I have been betrayed by those who swore the same oath I swore, men who put profit above justice and personal gain above the public good. The handwriting grew shakier as it continued, but the words remained clear. Thomas described a conspiracy involving cattle rustling, land fraud, and murder, orchestrated by a group that included Judge Harrison Wickham, Sheriff Pete Dulles, and businessman Clayton Barnes, names that hit Silas like physical blows. He'd known all three men, had even worked for Barnes on occasion during his gun-for-hire days. The proof lies in the hidden accounts Barnes keeps in his safe, documenting payments to hired guns and corrupt officials. Sheriff Dulles has been systematically eliminating homesteaders who refuse to sell their land to Barnes's development company. Judge Wickham ensures that any legal challenges disappear along with the men who file them. Silas paused in his reading, processing the implications. If Thomas was right, then half the territorial establishment was built on a foundation of theft and murder. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. It was what came next. I tried to get word to my brother Silas, knowing his reputation and his skills might be our only hope of stopping this before more innocent people die. But when I went to Perido Springs to find him, I discovered something that cuts deeper than any bullet wound. Maria Delgado, the woman he loves, has been feeding information to Barnes all along. Every move Silas makes, every job he takes, every place he goes, Barnes knows about it through her. The journal slipped from Silas's nerveless fingers, falling. Open on the sand. Boone nosed at his hand, trying to understand why his master had suddenly gone still as stone. The dog's touch brought Silas back to awareness, but the world looked different now, as if someone had shifted the position of familiar landmarks while he wasn't looking. Maria, a spy for Clayton Barnes, the woman who'd held him through nightmares, who'd begged him to find another way to live, who'd cried when he rode away from Perido Springs. She'd been reporting his every move to the enemy, every intimate conversation, every shared dream, every moment of vulnerability had been currency in a transaction he'd never even known was taking place. He picked up the journal with hands that felt disconnected from his body and forced himself to continue reading. I fear that Barnes intends to use Maria to lure Silas into an ambush. My brother doesn't know that his reputation has made him a threat to their operation. They can't simply ignore him. He knows too much about their methods and has too much influence among the men they use for their dirty work. They need him dead, but they need it to look like something other than assassination. The words blurred. As Silas read on, Thomas's increasingly desperate handwriting describing his attempts to stay ahead of the men hunting him. He'd tried to reach the territorial capital with evidence of the conspiracy, but Barnes's influence extended too far. Every route he tried was blocked. Every ally he approached had already been compromised or intimidated. I am writing this while taking shelter in an abandoned mining camp, 3 days' ride from Perido Springs. They are close now. I can hear their horses approaching. I have hidden copies of the evidence in 3 separate locations marked on the map I've drawn on the final page of this journal. If honest men still exist in this territory, they must find these documents and expose the truth. The next several pages contain detailed descriptions of financial records, witness statements, and correspondence that painted a clear picture of systematic corruption. Thomas had been thorough in his investigation, building a case that could destroy Barnes and his associates if it ever reached the right authorities. But it was the final entry, written in an increasingly unsteady hand, that broke Silas's heart completely. They are at the door now. I can hear Barnes's voice among them, and Sheriff Dulles is calling for me to surrender. They promise to make it quick if I come out peacefully, but I know what that promise is worth. I think about Silas often in these final moments, wishing I could tell him that I understand now why he chose the path he chose. The law I believed in so fervently is just another lie told by powerful men to control those beneath them. I hope someday he will forgive me for the harsh words I spoke when last we met. I hope he will understand that everything I did was done from love, even when it drove us apart. And I hope, if he ever learns the truth about Maria, that he will remember there are still people in this world worth saving, even if we ourselves cannot be saved. The journal ended there mid-sentence, as if Thomas had heard his killers breaking down the door. Silas stared at the bloodstains on the final page, knowing now that they marked the exact moment his brother's life had ended. Boone whined and pawed at the ground, sensing his master's anguish but unable to comfort it. The sun had moved significantly across the sky while Silas read, but he felt as if he'd lived through years rather than hours. Everything he thought he knew about his past had been revealed as illusion, carefully crafted by people who'd used his emotions as weapons against him. He closed the journal and sat in silence, watching the desert stretch away toward the horizon, where Perido Springs waited like a reckoning postponed but never forgotten. The sun reached its zenith, while Silas sat motionless beside the ancient saguaro, the journal lying closed in his lap like a sleeping serpent. Boone had settled beside him, occasionally lifting his head to scan the horizon for threats that existed more in memory than reality. The dog seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted in their world, though he couldn't comprehend the nature of that change. 20 years of carefully constructed peace lay shattered around Silas like broken pottery. Each memory he'd buried, each emotion he'd conquered, each hard-won moment of tranquility felt suddenly fragile and impermanent. The desert had been his sanctuary, but sanctuary only worked when the world agreed to leave you alone. Now, the world had reached out with dead fingers to drag him back into conflicts he'd thought resolved. He opened the journal again, this time to the crude map Thomas had drawn on the final page. 3 locations were marked with X's, each accompanied by cryptic notes. Old mine shaft, Devil's Canyon, 20 paces from the collapsed entrance. Look for the lightning-struck pine. Mission ruins, San Xavier, beneath the altar stone wrapped in oilskin. Perido Springs, Carmen's place, behind the loose brick 3rd from the corner 2nd floor. Carmen's place, Silas knew it well, a boarding house that catered to travelers who preferred discretion over comfort. Carmen Vasquez was a woman who asked no questions and remembered no faces, charging fair prices for clean rooms and honest meals. If Thomas had hidden evidence there, it might still be waiting, overlooked by anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The other locations posed different challenges. Devil's Canyon lay 2 days' ride to the north, through country controlled by Apache bands who didn't appreciate uninvited visitors. The mission ruins at San Xavier were closer, but more public, surrounded by the settlement that had grown up around the old Spanish structure. Retrieving evidence from either place would require careful planning and considerable risk. But it was the 3rd location that truly complicated matters. Going to Perido Springs meant confronting not just Barnes and his corrupt associates, but Maria as well. After 20 years, the thought of seeing her again stirred emotions he'd thought long dead. Anger, certainly, at the betrayal Thomas had revealed. But underneath the anger lay currents he didn't want to examine too closely: longing, regret, and a stubborn kernel of love that had survived despite everything. Silas stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long sit in the desert heat. Boone rose with him, tail wagging tentatively as if asking whether they were ready to resume their normal routine. But there would be nothing normal about what came next. The life they'd built together in the wilderness was about to be sacrificed on the altar of justice or revenge, though Silas wasn't entirely certain which motivation drove him more strongly. He walked to where Cisco waited patiently in whatever shade the desert provided. The horse's ears pricked forward at his approach. The mustang had carried him through countless miles of empty country, asking nothing more than water, grain, and the occasional kind word. Now, he would ask the animal to carry him back into the world of men, with all its complications and dangers. First, however, they needed supplies. His current provisions might last another week in the desert, but returning to civilization required different preparations. Clean clothes, ammunition for his sidearm, and currency that would be accepted in town. He also needed time to think, to plan, to prepare mentally for confrontations that had been postponed but never truly avoided. The cache, where he kept his emergency supplies, lay hidden in a canyon 3 hours' ride to the east. He'd established it years ago as insurance against the day when the desert might no longer be safe, though he'd never imagined using it for purposes like these. The cache contained gold coins sufficient to purchase whatever he might need, along with spare clothing and weapons he'd hoped never to touch again. As they rode toward the cache, Silas found himself remembering Thomas as he'd been in childhood, serious, determined, always trying to live up to standards that seemed impossibly high to their father's more pragmatic older son. Thomas had been the one who read law books by candlelight, who memorized the Constitution and dreamed of a world where justice meant more than the fastest draw or the deepest pockets. Their father, dead these 15 years, had been a circuit judge himself, riding from town to town throughout the territory, dispensing what passed for legal wisdom in places where the nearest courthouse lay hundreds of miles away. He'd tried to instill respect for the law in both his sons, but only Thomas had absorbed the lesson completely. Silas had learned different skills: how to read men's intentions in their eyes, how to survive in places where the law was just another word for whatever the strongest man decided. The irony wasn't lost on him that Thomas's faith in the system had gotten him killed, while Silas's cynical pragmatism had kept him alive long enough to avenge his brother's murder. Perhaps there was justice in that symmetry, or perhaps it was just another example of the world's fundamental unfairness. The cache lay hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural, but had been carefully arranged to conceal a small cave. Silas had chosen the location for its defensibility and its distance from any established trail. Even if someone stumbled across it accidentally, they would find nothing to suggest human presence unless they knew exactly what to look for. Inside the cave, wrapped in oiled canvas and stored in waterproof containers, lay the accumulated wealth of his gunfighting years. Gold, double eagles, silver dollars, and a few precious stones obtained through transactions he preferred not to remember. More importantly, the cave contained weapons: a matched pair of Colt peacemakers in custom holsters, a Winchester rifle, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. Silas lifted one of the revolvers, testing its weight and balance. The grips felt foreign, after 20 years of carrying only a basic utility knife and an old cap-and-ball pistol for protection against desert predators. These weapons had been crafted specifically for his hands, balanced and sighted to extend his natural abilities into the realm of legend. He'd been 23 when he'd commissioned them from a gunsmith in Denver, full of confidence in his own invincibility and hungry for the reputation that came with superior skill. The same smith had engraved small thunderbolts on the barrels, his calling card in those days, left behind to ensure credit for particularly impressive displays of marksmanship. Now, approaching 60, he felt none of that youthful certainty. His hands were steadier, his judgment better, his understanding of violence more complete. But he also knew the true cost of every bullet fired in anger, every life ended in the name of justice or profit or simple survival. The weapons felt heavier than he remembered, weighted with accumulated responsibility rather than mere steel and gunpowder. Boone watched from the cave entrance, clearly uncomfortable with the transformation he was witnessing. The dog had known only the peaceful version of his master, the man who settled disputes with words and solved problems through patient observation. This other Silas, the one who handled deadly weapons with casual expertise, was a stranger who smelled of old violence and bitter purpose. 3 days later, Silas rode into the settlement of Mesquite Wells, just as the morning sun painted the adobe buildings gold. The town existed primarily to service travelers crossing the desert, offering water, supplies, and a night's rest before the next grueling stretch of empty country. It was small enough to avoid the corruption that plagued larger settlements, but large enough to provide the resources he needed. He'd spent the intervening time transforming himself from desert hermit back into something resembling a civilized man. His beard was trimmed, his hair cut with the aid of a broken mirror, and his clothes, while dusty from travel, were clean and properly fitted. The transformation wasn't complete. 20 years of desert living had left permanent marks on his face and posture, but he no longer looked like a wild man emerging from the wilderness. The gun belt rode low on his hips, positioned for the quick draw that had once been second nature. The weight felt strange after so many years, but his body remembered the balance, adjusting his stride and posture automatically to accommodate the familiar burden. Boone trotted beside Cisco, alert but calm, trusting his master's judgment despite his obvious unease with returning to human civilization. The Oasis Saloon occupied the building closest to the town's single well, its painted sign faded but still legible. Silas tied Cisco to the hitching post and paused before entering, listening to the murmur of conversation within. Voices carried news faster than telegraph lines in this part of the territory, and he needed to know what people were saying about Barnes, Wickham, and the ongoing situation in Perido Springs. The interior was typical of frontier establishments: rough-hewn tables, a bar constructed from unpainted planks, and enough dust in the air to make the oil lamps necessary even during daylight hours. A dozen men occupied the space, most dressed as cowboys or miners, with a few who might have been merchants or professionals passing through on business. Conversation paused when he entered, heads turning to evaluate the newcomer, according to the ritual of frontier hospitality. Most glances were brief, categorizing him as another traveler before returning to previous discussions. But one man, sitting alone at a corner table, studied him with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Silas ordered whiskey from the bartender, a Mexican man whose scarred hands spoke of hard work and harder times. While he waited, he listened to the conversations around him, picking up fragments of information about territorial politics, weather conditions, and recent violence. "Barnes is expanding again," one cowboy told his companion. "Bought out the Henderson place last week after their well mysteriously went dry. Funny how that keeps happening to folks who won't sell." His companion, a grizzled man with a prospector's permanent squint, shook his head grimly. "Henderson was lucky to get out alive. I heard there was trouble with his cattle before the well went bad. Rustlers, maybe, or just bad luck. Either way, Barnes got prime grazing land for half what it was worth." The conversation confirmed what Thomas had written in his journal. Barnes was still using intimidation and sabotage to acquire property, which meant the corruption network remained intact. 20 years hadn't changed anything except the scale of the operation. "Stranger," called the man from the corner table. "You look familiar. Don't suppose you've been through Mesquite Wells before?" Silas turned slowly, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. The man was middle-aged, with the careful eyes of someone who'd lived through enough violence to recognize its approach. Something about his bearing suggested law enforcement, though he wore no badge. "Could be," Silas replied neutrally. "I've traveled these parts for many years. Name's Frank Morrison. Used to be sheriff over in Bisbee before I retired." The man stood and approached the bar, moving with the deliberate caution of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the wrong word could be. "Your face is familiar, but I can't quite place it. Maybe you could help me remember." The other patrons had gone quiet, sensing the undercurrent of tension that accompanied such conversations. In territories where reputation could mean the difference between respect and violence, A man's identity was never a casual matter. Silas considered his options. Morrison clearly suspected something, but hadn't yet made the connection that would identify him completely. A false name might buy time, but would also create suspicions that could follow him to Perido Springs. Better to control the revelation than let it happen accidentally. Silas McGraw, he said simply. The silence that followed was complete. Even the bartender froze in the act of wiping down glasses, his eyes wide with recognition of a name that belonged to frontier legend. Morrison's hand didn't move toward his gun, but his posture shifted into readiness for violence that might come without warning. Silas McGraw, Morrison repeated thoughtfully. Haven't heard that name spoken aloud in near 20 years. Most folks figured you were dead, or at least permanently retired from the business that made you famous. Retirement can be temporary, Silas observed, sipping his whiskey. Circumstances change. Indeed they do. Morrison returned to his table but remained standing. Would those changed circumstances have anything to do with recent events in Perido Springs? Word is that Clayton Barnes has been asking questions about old-timers who might bear grudges against successful businessmen. The information was both valuable and troubling. If Barnes was actively seeking information about potential threats, then the corruption network was more paranoid and more dangerous than Thomas had realized. It also meant that Silas's return to active life wouldn't remain secret for long. Barnes always did worry too much about things that weren't his concern, Silas said carefully. Morrison smiled grimly. Funny thing about Barnes's concerns, they have a way of becoming other people's problems. Permanent problems, if you catch my meaning. The warning was clear, delivered with the authority of a man who'd seen the consequences of underestimating organized corruption. Barnes and his associates had evolved beyond simple intimidation. They now commanded resources sufficient to eliminate threats proactively rather than reactively. I appreciate the advice, Silas replied. A man can't have too many friends in times like these. Friends are useful, Morrison agreed. So is information. If you're planning what I think you're planning, you should know that Barnes has hired professional help. Men from back east who don't share local concerns about collateral damage. Professional killers, then. Barnes was no longer relying solely on corrupt local officials and intimidated cowboys. He'd imported talent from regions where violence was more refined and considerably more lethal. The stakes had risen substantially since Thomas's time. Silas finished his whiskey and left coins on the bar, sufficient to buy drinks for every man present. It was an old gesture, one that acknowledged respect while avoiding direct confrontation. Morrison nodded appreciatively, understanding the diplomatic significance of the gesture. As he prepared to leave, the former sheriff spoke once more. McGraw, if you're riding toward Perido Springs, you might want to know that Maria Delgado still lives there. Runs a boarding house now, caters to respectable folks passing through on business. The information hit like a physical blow, though Silas kept his expression neutral. Maria was alive, still in Perido Springs, still operating in the gray areas between legitimate business and questionable associations. The boarding house would provide perfect cover for continued intelligence gathering, if that was indeed her role in Barnes's operation. Outside, Boone waited patiently in whatever shade he could find, ears pricked forward at his master's approach. The dog sensed the increased tension, but offered no judgment, only the unconditional loyalty that had sustained them both through years of mutual dependence. As they rode out of Mesquite Wells, Silas knew their conversation would be discussed and analyzed until every nuance had been examined for meaning. By sunset, word would spread that Silas McGraw had returned to active life. By tomorrow, Barnes would know that his carefully constructed empire faced a threat that couldn't be bought, intimidated, or reasoned with. 2 days out from Mesquite Wells, Silas knew they were being followed. Boone had been restless since dawn, frequently looking back along their trail with the focused attention that meant danger. The dog's instincts had kept them alive too many times for Silas to ignore the warning, even when his own senses detected nothing obviously threatening. They were riding through broken country where red sandstone formations created a maze of canyons and hidden valleys. It was perfect terrain for an ambush, offering countless positions where armed men could wait unseen while their quarry approached along predictable routes. Silas had chosen this path precisely because it avoided the main roads where travelers might be easily intercepted, but that same isolation now worked against them. He reined in Cisco beside a cluster of boulders that provided both shade and cover, dismounting to study the back trail through field glasses he'd retrieved from his cache. The high-quality lenses revealed details invisible to the naked eye, including the telltale dust cloud that marked riders moving parallel to his route, staying just far enough back to avoid direct observation. 3 men, possibly 4, maintaining a distance that suggested professional tracking rather than casual travel. They'd been following since he left Mesquite Wells, probably alerted by someone who'd recognized him and seen opportunity in the information. Barnes would pay well for advance warning of his approach, and there were always men willing to earn easy money by selling news to the highest bidder. The situation presented choices, none of them particularly appealing. He could try to outrun his pursuers, relying on Cisco's endurance and his own knowledge of the terrain to reach Perido Springs ahead of them. He could confront them directly, using his reputation and demonstrated willingness to fight as leverage in negotiations. Or he could disappear into the wilderness, abandoning his mission rather than risk the kind of violence that would inevitably follow discovery. None of these options satisfied him. Running would only delay the confrontation while giving his enemies time to prepare additional surprises. Direct confrontation would result in bloodshed that might alert Barnes to his presence before he could gather the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. Disappearing would mean abandoning Thomas's memory and the quest for justice that had brought him this far. Instead, he chose a 4th option. Leading Cisco deeper into the canyon, he found a sheltered area where the horse could wait safely while he dealt with the immediate threat. Boone whined softly, understanding that separation was coming, but trusting his master's judgment despite his obvious concern. "Stay with Cisco," Silas told the dog firmly. "Keep him quiet, and don't come looking for me, no matter what you hear." Boone's ears drooped, but he took his position beside the horse, instinctively understanding the gravity of the situation. Both animals had lived through enough frontier violence to recognize the signs of approaching conflict. Silas checked his weapons one final time, ensuring the Colts moved smoothly in their holsters and that spare ammunition was easily accessible. 20 years of peaceful living hadn't erased the muscle memory that made such preparations automatic. His hands moved with unconscious efficiency, loading and checking mechanisms that could mean the difference between life and death in the minutes ahead. The climb to high ground took 30 minutes, following game trails that wound between towering rock formations. From the ridge above, he could see the entire approach to the canyon, including the route his pursuers would take if they continued their current heading. More importantly, he could position himself to control the encounter on his own terms. The men appeared shortly after noon, riding single file through the narrow passage that led to the canyon floor. Silas studied them through his field glasses, noting details that would inform his tactical decisions. The leader was a tall man, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, his clothing and equipment suggesting professional status rather than casual opportunism. Behind him rode 3 others, each armed with rifles in addition to sidearms. Their formation and movement patterns spoke of military or law enforcement training, the kind of disciplined cooperation that marked experienced fighters. These weren't local cowboys hoping to collect bounty money. They were specialists imported specifically to deal with threats like the one he represented. Silas considered his position carefully. The high ground gave him significant tactical advantages, but also limited his options for withdrawal if the situation deteriorated beyond his ability to control. Once he revealed himself, the encounter would develop according to the deadly logic of frontier violence, where mistakes were measured in lives rather than mere embarrassment. When the riders reached the canyon floor directly below his position, he called out in a voice that carried clearly in the still air, "That's far enough. Gentlemen, state your business in country that doesn't welcome uninvited visitors." The response was immediate and professional. The men dispersed quickly, seeking cover behind rocks and scrub vegetation, while their leader remained mounted, hands visible but positioned for quick access to his weapons. "Mr. McGraw," the leader called back, his voice carrying an Eastern accent that confirmed Morrison's warning about imported talent. "My name is Jonathan Crane. I represent certain business interests that would like to discuss mutually beneficial arrangements with you." "I'm listening," Silas replied, though he kept his rifle trained on the mounted figure below. "Mr. Barnes has authorized me to offer substantial compensation in exchange for your agreement to conclude your current business elsewhere. The amount is negotiable, but I'm confident we can reach terms that satisfy all parties." The offer was exactly what Silas had expected, an attempt to buy him off before violence became necessary. Barnes was wealthy enough to make such offers genuinely attractive, and experienced enough to know that even legendary gunslingers could be motivated by practical considerations rather than romantic notions of justice. "What makes Barnes think I have business that concerns him?" Silas asked. Crane's laugh was genuinely amused. "Mr. McGraw, your reputation preceded you into Mesquite Wells, and your intentions are hardly mysterious. A man doesn't emerge from 20 years of retirement without compelling motivation. We simply want to ensure that your motivations don't conflict with our employer's legitimate interests." "Legitimate interests," Silas repeated. "That's an interesting way to describe what Barnes has been doing in this territory." "Business is business, Mr. McGraw. Sometimes it requires methods that appear harsh to outside observers, but results speak for themselves. Mr. Barnes has brought prosperity and development to regions that previously offered nothing but hardship and failure." The conversation was proceeding exactly as frontier negotiations always did. Polite words concealing deadly intentions, civilized language masking primitive realities. Both sides understood the subtext perfectly. If Silas refused the offer, violence would follow with mathematical certainty. "Tell Barnes I appreciate his generosity," Silas said finally, "but some things aren't for sale." Crane nodded as if he'd expected that response. "I was afraid you might feel that way. Mr. Barnes will be disappointed, but not surprised. He asked me to convey his regrets about the necessity of what happens next." The signal, when it came, was subtle, a slight movement of Crane's left hand that his companions had obviously been watching for. All four men moved simultaneously, diving for better cover while bringing their weapons to bear on Silas's position. The gunfight lasted less than 30 seconds, but those seconds stretched like hours in Silas's perception. Time moved with the strange elasticity that combat veterans knew well, each movement and decision extending into crystalline clarity while the world around them blurred into irrelevance. His first shot took Crane's horse, the animal's scream echoing off canyon walls as it collapsed, pinning its rider beneath its thrashing weight. The choice was deliberate. Dead men told no tales, but wounded men carried messages back to their employers. Silas wanted Barnes to understand exactly what kind of enemy he'd chosen to make. The other three men had found cover among the rocks, their rifles barking rapid fire that sent stone chips flying around Silas's position. Their accuracy was professional but not exceptional, suggesting competence rather than artistry. These were skilled craftsmen of violence, not artists like the gunfighters of legend. Silas moved position after each shot, using terrain and shadow to frustrate their attempts to target him effectively. 20 years of desert living had taught him patience and conservation of effort, lessons that served him well now as younger men exhausted their ammunition in displays of firepower rather than precision. His second shot found one of the riflemen who'd exposed too much of himself while trying to get a better angle. The bullet took the man in the shoulder, spinning him away from his cover and sending his weapon clattering across the rocks. Not a killing wound, but sufficient to remove him from the immediate fight. The remaining two men showed commendable discipline, ceasing their wild firing to coordinate their positions for a more effective assault. Silas watched them communicate through hand signals, planning a flanking maneuver that would force him to divide his attention between multiple angles of attack. Before they could execute their plan, he moved again, ghosting along the ridgeline, to a position that gave him clear fields of fire toward both men's hiding places. The Winchester spoke twice in rapid succession, and suddenly the canyon fell silent, except for the moans of wounded men and the nervous stamping of horses. Silas waited 5 full minutes before descending to the canyon floor, rifle ready and senses alert for any sign of continued resistance. The professional in him noted details automatically: blood patterns that indicated the severity of wounds, weapon positions that revealed the skill levels of his opponents, and equipment quality that confirmed these men represented serious investment rather than casual hiring. Crane was conscious but trapped beneath his dead horse, his face pale with pain and shock. One leg was clearly broken, probably in several places, and his breathing suggested possible internal injuries. He would live, but his career as a mobile enforcer was finished. This didn't have to happen, Crane said through gritted teeth as Silas approached. No, Silas agreed, it didn't, but Barnes chose to make it happen when he sent professional killers after a man who wanted to be left alone. You're not being left alone, McGraw. You're the one who came back from the dead, too. Disturb a peaceful business arrangement. Silas knelt beside the trapped man, checking his wounds with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd treated battlefield injuries before. Peaceful for Barnes, maybe. Not so peaceful for the people he's been robbing and murdering. He used rocks and leverage to lift the horse's carcass, enough for Crane to drag himself free, an act of mercy that surprised the injured man. In Crane's world, enemies didn't help each other, and conflicts ended only with complete victory or total defeat. Why? Crane asked as Silas helped him to a sitting position against a boulder. Because you're not my enemy, Silas replied. You're just a hired gun doing a job. I've been where you are, taking money from men whose methods I didn't examine too closely. The real enemy is the one who pays the bills. The other two men were alive, but incapacitated, their wounds requiring medical attention that only a town doctor could provide. Silas gathered their weapons and horses, ensuring they couldn't resume hostilities even if they recovered enough to attempt it. Tell Barnes this was a warning, he said to Crane as he prepared to leave. The next time he sends killers after me, I won't be so charitable about the outcome. Crane managed a bitter smile. He's not going to take this well. Good. Maybe it'll make him think twice about the cost of protecting his empire. Silas left them with enough water to survive until they could be rescued, but took their weapons and horses to prevent immediate pursuit. The wounded men would eventually make their way back to civilization with their tale of defeat, carrying the message that Silas McGraw was very much alive and considerably more dangerous than Barnes had calculated. The encounter had cost him precious time, but it had also provided valuable intelligence. Barnes was worried enough about potential threats to invest in professional protection, which meant the evidence Thomas had gathered posed a genuine danger to the conspiracy. More importantly, the fact that his pursuers had found him so quickly suggested Barnes had sources of information throughout the territory. The mission ruins of San Xavier lay 2 days' ride to the south, through country that offered better concealment but more challenging travel. Silas pushed hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary for rest and water. Boone seemed to understand the urgency, trotting tirelessly beside Cisco without his usual stops to investigate interesting scents or sounds. The ruins appeared at Sunset on the second day, stone walls rising from the desert floor like the bones of some ancient beast. Spanish missionaries had built the structure 2 centuries earlier, hoping to bring civilization and Christianity to the wilderness. Time and weather had reduced their ambitious architecture to romantic fragments, but enough remained to provide shelter and landmarks for travelers. Thomas's directions led him to what had once been the chapel's altar, now reduced to scattered stones and stubborn weeds. Counting 20 paces from the largest remaining block, Silas began digging where his brother's map indicated the evidence waited. The oilskin package lay 18 inches down, wrapped in multiple layers of protection against moisture and time. Inside, Silas found documents that confirmed and expanded upon everything Thomas had written in his journal. Bank records showing payments to hired guns, correspondence discussing the elimination of troublesome homesteaders, and property deeds that revealed the scope of Barnes's illegal acquisitions, but it was the final document that made his hands tremble with rage. A letter in Barnes's own handwriting, dated 3 weeks before Thomas's death, ordering the marshal's assassination and specifying that it should appear to be the result of a routine law enforcement action rather than deliberate murder. The letter was signed and witnessed, legal proof of conspiracy to commit murder that could destroy Barnes and everyone associated with him. Thomas had died gathering this evidence, but his sacrifice hadn't been in vain if the documents reached honest authorities. As Silas carefully rewrapped the evidence, he realized that his mission had evolved beyond simple revenge into something approaching genuine justice. His brother's death would be avenged, but more importantly, the system of corruption that had killed him would be exposed and destroyed. The third cache location in Devil's Canyon proved more challenging to reach than the mission ruins, requiring a full day's detour through Apache territory that kept Silas constantly alert for signs of hostile presence. The indigenous peoples had every right to be suspicious of armed strangers crossing their traditional lands, especially given the recent history of broken treaties and violent confrontations with territorial authorities. Boone's behavior remained agitated throughout the journey, though Silas couldn't determine whether the dog sensed human threats or simply reacted to the emotional tension that had surrounded them since the gunfight. Either way, the animal's unease added another layer of stress to an already dangerous expedition. The lightning-struck pine that marked Thomas's hiding place stood like a blackened finger against the canyon wall, its twisted branches reaching skyward in a gesture that seemed to embrace the very forces that had destroyed it. 20 paces from its base, following his brother's careful directions, Silas found the third cache of evidence buried beneath a carefully arranged pile of stones. This package was larger than the others, containing not just documents, but also a leather-bound ledger that appeared to be Barnes's personal accounting of the conspiracy's financial operations. The detail was extraordinary. Every bribe paid, every property acquired, every assassination commissioned, all recorded with the meticulous care of a successful businessman managing a complex enterprise. But it was a letter hidden in the ledgers, back cover that transformed Silas's understanding of the entire situation. Written in Maria's distinctive handwriting, it was addressed to someone identified only as Colonel and dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's death. The situation grows increasingly dangerous, the letter began. Barnes suspects that Deputy Marshal McGraw is gathering evidence against the organization and has given orders for his elimination. I have tried to redirect suspicion away from Thomas by providing false information about his whereabouts, but Barnes's network is more extensive than we initially believed. Silas read the letter 3 times before its implications fully registered. Maria hadn't been feeding information to Barnes for money or coercion. She'd been working against him, apparently as part of some larger investigation or operation directed by this mysterious colonel. The letter continued. Our original mission parameters have changed dramatically. What began as investigation of territorial corruption has revealed connections reaching to the highest levels of federal government. Barnes is not the head of this organization, merely a regional manager reporting to authorities in Washington whose identities remain unknown to us. Federal corruption. The conspiracy wasn't limited to territorial politics and local business interests, but extended into the national government itself. Thomas had discovered something far more dangerous than simple fraud and murder. He'd uncovered evidence of systemic corruption that threatened the foundations of American democracy. In the Western Territories, recommend immediate extraction of all assets and transmission of evidence to Washington contacts we know to be clean. The Deputy Marshal's investigation has proceeded too far to be contained by local measures. Barnes has requested permission to escalate responses beyond current authorization levels. The final paragraph chilled Silas's blood. Personal note, have maintained cover identity with Silas McGraw as directed, but emotional complications threaten operational security. Recommend immediate reassignment following completion of current mission. The personal cost of this deception has become unacceptable. Maria had been ordered to get close to him. Their entire relationship, every moment of intimacy and shared dreams, had been part of an elaborate intelligence operation designed to monitor his activities and control his influence on territorial affairs. The woman he'd loved, the woman he'd been prepared to kill for her betrayal, had been betraying not him, but the very people he'd thought she served. Silas sat heavily on a fallen log, the letter trembling in his hands as the full scope of the deception became clear. Maria had sacrificed her own happiness and their relationship to serve a cause larger than personal desires. She'd allowed him to believe the worst about her, rather than compromise a mission that could expose corruption reaching to the nation's capital. But who was the colonel directing these operations? What federal agency had the authority to conduct such deep cover investigations without the knowledge of territorial officials? And most importantly, if Barnes was merely a regional manager who controlled the larger conspiracy? Boone approached cautiously, sensing his master's emotional turmoil, but uncertain how to provide comfort. The dog pressed against Silas's leg, offering the simple solace of physical contact, while the human world revealed new layers of complexity and betrayal. Sound from the canyon rim brought Silas back to immediate awareness of his surroundings. Horses approaching, moving with the careful pace of riders who understood they were entering dangerous territory. He gathered the evidence quickly, stuffing documents into his saddlebags while positioning himself for whatever confrontation was developing. 3 riders descended into the canyon, but these weren't more of Barnes's hired killers. The lead figure wore the blue uniform of a U.S. cavalry officer, while his companions dressed in the practical clothing of frontier scouts or investigators. They approached with hands visible and weapons holstered, clearly intending negotiation rather than violence. "Mr. McGraw," the officer called when they reached speaking distance. "Colonel Marcus Wade, United States Army Intelligence. I believe you have something that belongs to us." Wade was a man in his 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and the careful eyes of an intelligence professional. His uniform was dusty from travel, but properly maintained, and his escorts moved with the disciplined alertness of veteran soldiers. "Depends on what you think I have," Silas replied cautiously. Evidence gathered by Deputy Marshal Thomas McGraw during his investigation of territorial corruption. Evidence that has cost several good men their lives and compromised an operation. "And 3 years in the making. Thomas was working for you?" Wade dismounted and approached with the deliberate calm of someone trying to defuse a volatile situation. Deputy Marshal McGraw was recruited to assist our investigation when his regular duties brought him into contact with the Barnes organization. He wasn't trained for intelligence work, but his integrity and local knowledge made him valuable. Enough to get him killed. Yes, Wade acknowledged without hesitation. Thomas knew the risks and accepted them. He believed the corruption he'd discovered was too dangerous to ignore, even if fighting it cost him his life. The admission was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd made similar calculations many times before. In Wade's world, individual lives were weighed against larger strategic objectives, and personal losses were acceptable if they served the greater good. "What about Maria Delgado?" Silas asked. Wade's expression softened slightly. "Agent Delgado has been operating under deep cover for over 4 years. Her relationship with you was initially part of her assignment, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Her reports indicated that personal feelings had complicated her professional judgment. She fell in love with her target, yes, which made her invaluable for monitoring your activities, but also created vulnerabilities that ultimately compromised her effectiveness." Silas felt a complex mixture of relief and renewed anger. Relief that Maria hadn't betrayed him for money or coercion, but anger that their entire relationship had been built on lies, serving a government that operated in shadows and sacrificed individuals for abstract principles. "Why should I trust you?" he demanded. Wade reached slowly into his jacket and withdrew a leather folder containing official documents. "Because, Mr. McGraw, we need your help to finish what your brother started. Barnes is planning to eliminate every witness and destroy all evidence before fleeing the territory. If we don't stop him in the next 48 hours, the entire conspiracy will disappear, and men like Thomas will have died for nothing." The documents were genuine. Federal authorizations, intelligence assessments, and operational plans that revealed the scope of the investigation Barnes had stumbled into. The corruption network included territorial judges, federal appointees, and congressmen whose votes could be purchased with Western gold and development contracts. "What do you want from me?" Silas asked finally. "Help us take down Barnes and his organization before they can escape justice. You know this territory, you understand how these men think, and your reputation gives you access to places where uniformed soldiers would be unwelcome." Wade gestured toward the evidence scattered around them. "Thomas gathered the proof we need, but gathering evidence and acting on it are different skills. We need someone who can get close enough to Barnes to ensure he doesn't escape before we can arrest him." Silas studied the colonel's face, trying to read the man's true intentions. Government agents lied as naturally as they breathed, serving masters whose agendas shifted according to political expediency rather than moral principles. But the alternative was letting Barnes and his associates escape unpunished, leaving Thomas's death meaningless. "And Maria?" he asked. "Agent Delgado is currently maintaining her cover in Perido Springs, waiting for orders. If you agree to assist us, you'll be working with her to coordinate the final phase of this operation." The prospect of seeing Maria again, of confronting the woman who'd loved him while lying to him, stirred emotions Silas wasn't prepared to examine. But if justice for Thomas required facing that particular ghost from his past, he would find the strength to do whatever the mission demanded. The abandoned mining camp where Colonel Wade had established his temporary headquarters lay hidden in a box canyon 15 miles north of Perido Springs. The location offered concealment from casual observation while providing multiple escape routes if the operation went wrong. Wade's team had transformed the ruins into a functional command post, complete with maps, communication equipment, and detailed intelligence files on every significant figure in Barnes's organization. Silas studied the operational plans spread across a makeshift table constructed from salvaged mine timbers. The level of detail was impressive. Building layouts, guard rotations, financial records, and personal dossiers that revealed intimate knowledge of the enemy's capabilities and vulnerabilities. Wade's people had been watching Barnes for months, documenting every aspect of his operation with military precision. Barnes maintains his primary office in the Cattleman's Bank building, Wade explained, pointing to detailed architectural drawings. The safe containing his most sensitive records is located on the second floor, behind a false wall that most people don't know exists. Agent Delgado has confirmed that he stores original documents there rather than trusting copies to subordinates. The Mention of Maria's name still caused Silas's chest to tighten with conflicting emotions. 3 days had passed since his encounter with Wade in Devil's Canyon, but he hadn't yet decided how to handle the personal aspects of their shared mission. Professional cooperation was one thing. Emotional reconciliation was considerably more complicated. "What about security?" asked Sergeant Murphy, one of Wade's scouts. The man had spent 20 years in the cavalry, fighting Indians and outlaws throughout the southwestern territories. His weathered face bore scars that testified to his experience with frontier violence. "Barnes keeps 6 men on permanent duty," Wade replied. 2 at the bank during business hours, 2 at his residence, and 2 mobile guards who patrol between his various properties. All are armed and experienced, but none have military training. Silas examined the guard schedules, noting patterns that suggested vulnerabilities. "What about Judge Wickham and Sheriff Dulles? They won't sit quietly while we arrest their business partner." "Wickham is in Santa Fe on territorial business. Convenient timing that suggests someone tipped him off about potential problems. Dulles remains in town, but his deputies have been systematically reassigned to patrol duties that keep them away from the immediate area." The implications were clear. Barnes was consolidating his forces and eliminating potential complications, preparing either for a final decisive action or a strategic withdrawal from the territory. Either possibility made their mission more urgent and considerably more dangerous. Wade pulled out a telegram that had arrived that morning via military courier. "Washington has authorized the use of any necessary force to prevent the destruction of evidence or the escape of key conspirators. We have carte blanche to do whatever it takes to bring this operation to a successful conclusion." Such authorizations were double-edged weapons. They provided freedom of action, but also made clear that failure would result in official denial and abandonment. If the mission went wrong, Wade's team would be disavowed as rogue agents acting without proper authority. "Timeline?" Silas asked. "Barnes is scheduled to meet with his financial backers tomorrow evening. Intelligence suggests they're planning to liquidate local assets and transfer operations to California. If they complete that transfer, we'll lose jurisdiction and any chance of exposing the federal connections. 24 hours to plan and execute an operation against a well-prepared enemy operating on familiar ground." The timeline was tight, even for experienced military units, and Wade's improvised team included civilians with no formal combat training. "I'll need to coordinate with Maria," Silas said reluctantly. "If she's maintaining cover, she might have access to information that could make the difference between success and failure." Wade nodded approvingly. "Agent Delgado has been monitoring Barnes's activities from her position at the boarding house. She'll brief you on current conditions when you reach town." The prospect of seeing Maria again after 20 years stirred memories Silas had worked hard to suppress. Not just the pain of believing himself betrayed, but the deeper ache of love. Interrupted rather than resolved. They'd been planning a life together when he rode away from Perido Springs, dreams of peace and domesticity that had sustained him through the early years of his desert exile. Now he would face her knowing that everything between them had been complicated by deceptions he was only beginning to understand. She'd been ordered to get close to him, but her feelings had apparently become genuine over time. The question was whether any foundation remained for trust between two people who'd both become professional liars. "What's the extraction plan if things go wrong?" Murphy asked. Wade pointed to several routes marked on the map in red ink. "Primary extraction point is here at the old stage station. Secondary is the river crossing near Miller's Ranch. If both are compromised, we scatter and rendezvous at the original base camp." Silas studied the escape routes with professional interest. They were well planned, offering multiple options for withdrawal under different threat conditions. But they also assumed that retreat would be possible, which might not be the case if Barnes decided to eliminate all witnesses rather than simply escape jurisdiction. As the afternoon wore on, Wade's team refined their assault plan with the methodical attention to detail that characterized successful military operations. Every contingency was considered, every role assigned, every equipment requirement catalogued and verified. But despite their thoroughness, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that they were planning for the battle Barnes wanted them to fight, rather than the one he was actually preparing. The thought troubled him enough to voice his concerns during the evening briefing. What if Barnes isn't planning to run? What if he's decided to eliminate the threats instead of avoiding them? Wade looked up from the duty roster he'd been reviewing. Explain. Everything we know about his preparation suggests someone getting ready for a fight, not a retreat. Consolidating security, positioning assets, clearing potential complications. Those are the actions of a man planning to stand and fight. Murphy nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. Barnes has spent years building his organization. Might be he'd rather destroy it himself than let the government take it apart piece by piece. If that's his plan, Wade said slowly, then we're walking into a trap designed specifically for us. The possibility reframed the entire operation. Instead of capturing Barnes before he could escape, they might be preventing him from implementing a scorched earth strategy that would eliminate all evidence and witnesses. The stakes were the same, but the tactical situation was completely different. We proceed as planned, Wade decided after several minutes of consideration. But we adjust our assumptions about enemy intentions. This becomes a combat operation rather than an arrest mission. Silas spent the evening cleaning and checking his weapons, a ritual that had sustained him through countless dangerous nights. During his gunfighting years, the Colts felt familiar in his hands now, no longer foreign objects, but extensions of his will made manifest in steel and gunpowder. Boone watched from his position beside the fire, understanding that tomorrow would bring the kind of violence that had marked their early years together. As night deepened over the mining camp, Silas found himself thinking about Thomas and the choices that had led them all to this moment. His brother had believed in justice as an abstract principle worth dying for, while Silas had always understood it as something more personal, the settling of accounts between specific individuals rather than the triumph of universal ideals. Now, those two concepts of justice were converging in ways that might honor Thomas's memory, while satisfying Silas's need for personal vindication. If they succeeded tomorrow, the corruption network would be exposed and its leaders brought to trial. If they failed, at least Thomas's death would be avenged through direct action rather than legal processes that could be manipulated by the very people they sought to punish. The sound of approaching horses brought everyone to alertness. Wade's sentries had challenged someone, and after a brief exchange of recognition codes, a single rider entered the camp. In the firelight, Silas recognized the lean figure and distinctive riding style of Agent Delgado. Maria looked older than he remembered, her face marked by lines that spoke of stress and difficult choices rather than mere passage of time. She wore the practical clothing of a frontier businesswoman, but her posture and awareness revealed the training that had made her effective as a deep-cover operative. Their eyes met across the firelight, and for a moment, the years collapsed. Between them, she was still the woman he'd loved, still possessed of the strength and intelligence that had originally attracted him. But she was also someone else now, shaped by experiences and loyalties he could only guess at. "Silas," she said, simply dismounting and approaching the fire with the controlled grace of someone prepared for any reaction. "Maria." He stood to face her, uncertain whether the encounter would end in violence, reconciliation, or something more complex than either. "We need to talk," she said. "About tomorrow, about Barnes, and about things that should have been said 20 years ago." Wade cleared his throat diplomatically. "Agent Delgado, please brief us on current conditions in town before you address personal matters." But Silas was already walking toward the edge of the firelight, knowing that some conversations couldn't happen in front of witnesses, no matter how professional the circumstances. Maria followed, and for the first time in 2 decades, they stood alone together under the vast darkness of the desert sky. Dawn broke grey and cold over Perido Springs as Silas rode into town alone, exactly as planned. The settlement looked much as he remembered. Dusty streets lined with adobe buildings, horses tied to hitching posts outside saloons and general stores, and the constant background noise of commerce and conversation that marked frontier communities. But underneath the familiar surface, he sensed the tension that preceded violence. Maria's intelligence briefing had revealed disturbing developments. Barnes had spent the previous week consolidating his forces, bringing in additional hired guns from El Paso and Tucson. More ominously, he'd ordered the removal of all sensitive documents from his various offices, centralizing everything in the bank safe that Wade's team planned to raid. The Cattleman's Bank occupied the corner of Main and Territory Streets, a substantial 2-story building constructed of local stone and imported timber. Barnes had spared no expense in creating an edifice that projected stability and permanence, though Silas now understood that the impressive facade concealed operations having little to do with legitimate banking. He tied Cisco to the hitching post outside Carmen's boarding house, noting the subtle signs that marked Maria's establishment as different from its competitors. The windows were clean, the steps swept, and the sign advertising rooms painted in clear, readable letters. Small details that suggested professional management rather than casual enterprise. Boone remained with the horse, as agreed during the previous night's planning session. The dog's presence would complicate the operation, and Silas couldn't risk his companion's safety during what promised to be intense urban combat. Better to leave him where he could escape if things went wrong. Inside the boarding house, Maria greeted him with the careful courtesy appropriate for any paying customer. Other guests occupied the common room, traveling merchants, territorial officials, and businessmen whose presence provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering. None appeared to recognize Silas, though his weathered appearance differed significantly from descriptions that might circulate among Barnes's associates. "Room 12 is available," Maria said formally, handing him a key. "Second floor, rear of the building, overlooking the alley. Very quiet for travelers who value their rest." The coded message was clear. Room 12 provided observation of the bank's rear entrance and access to rooftop escape routes. From there, he could monitor the target building while Wade's team moved into position for the coordinated assault. In his room, Silas checked his weapons one final time and reviewed the building's layout according to the architectural drawings Wade had provided. The bank's safe was located directly below his position, separated by 20 feet of vertical distance, but accessible through windows that faced the alley. If the main assault encountered resistance, he could provide covering fire or create a distraction that might tip the balance in their favor. At precisely 10 o'clock, he saw Wade's team approach from different directions, each man maintaining the casual appearance of ordinary business in town. Murphy entered the bank's front door, posing as a prospective customer seeking information about loans. 2 other agents positioned themselves across the street, ready to intercept anyone attempting to flee the building. Silas opened his window and settled into position with his rifle, commanding views of both the bank's rear exit and the street, where Barnes maintained his private office. Everything proceeded according to plan, until he noticed movement that hadn't been included in their intelligence reports. Armed men were taking positions throughout the commercial district, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit executing a prepared defensive plan. Barnes hadn't just consolidated his forces, he'd transformed the entire downtown area into a fortress, with overlapping fields of fire and predetermined fighting positions. Wade's team was walking into an ambush far more sophisticated than anything they'd anticipated. Barnes had somehow learned about the impending raid and prepared accordingly, turning their carefully planned operation into a deadly trap. Silas counted at least 12 defenders in positions that dominated every approach to the bank. More troubling, Several wore the uniforms of deputy sheriffs, suggesting that local law enforcement had been completely compromised. Sheriff Dulles might have been officially uninformed about the federal investigation, but he'd clearly chosen sides in the coming battle. The situation demanded immediate action. Silas could warn Wade's team, but doing so would compromise his own position and eliminate any chance of completing the mission successfully. Alternatively, he could trust Wade's combat experience to recognize the trap and adapt accordingly, while maintaining his own freedom of action for whatever opportunities might develop. Before he could choose between options, the shooting started. Murphy's voice carried clearly from the bank's interior, apparently demanding to see Barnes on urgent business. The response came in the form of gunfire, followed immediately by the crash of breaking glass as the careful pretense of normal business collapsed into open warfare. Wade's remaining agents responded with professional speed, taking cover and returning fire while attempting to reach their trapped teammate, but their positions had been anticipated, and Barnes's defenders commanded superior terrain and firepower. Silas made his choice. Instead of retreating or waiting for better opportunities, he began systematically eliminating Barnes's rooftop spotters, using precision rifle fire to disrupt their coordination and create confusion in their defensive plan. The battle for Perido Springs lasted 30 minutes, but those minutes redefined the town's history forever. Silas's precision rifle fire from the boarding house window eliminated 3 of Barnes's spotters before the defenders realized where the shots were coming from. By then, Wade's team had rallied and begun their own systematic assault on the bank. Building. Murphy's voice could be heard shouting from inside the bank, apparently still alive, but pinned down by defenders who'd barricaded themselves behind heavy wooden counters. The federal agent's survival suggested that Barnes wanted prisoners rather than corpses, possibly for interrogation about the scope of the federal investigation. Silas abandoned his sniper position and descended to the boarding house's main floor, where Maria waited with weapons and additional ammunition. She'd shed any pretense of civilian identity, now openly carrying a military-issue rifle and wearing a gun belt that suggested considerable familiarity with frontier violence. "Barnes is in his private office above the bank," she reported tersely. 4 men with him, including Sheriff Dulles. They're preparing to destroy the safe's contents rather than let them fall into federal hands. The information crystallized Silas's tactical priorities. If Barnes succeeded in burning the evidence, Thomas's death would accomplish nothing, and the corruption network would survive to continue operations elsewhere. Whatever personal reckonings awaited between him and Barnes would have to wait until the mission was secured. They exited through the boarding house's rear door into the alley that separated Maria's establishment from the bank building. The narrow space offered concealment from most of the defenders, but also limited their options for maneuvering if the situation deteriorated further. Wade appeared from behind a wagon overturned to serve as cover, his uniform torn and bloody. From a graze across his left arm. "Murphy's alive but trapped. We need to reach him before Barnes decides prisoners are more trouble than they're worth." Silas studied the bank's rear entrance, noting the heavy door and small windows that would make assault extremely difficult. What about the safe? "Second floor, accessible through external stairs if we can clear the defenders." Wade checked his rifle's ammunition, calculating resources against requirements. "Can you and Agent Delgado create a distraction while my remaining men attempt the stairs?" The plan was desperate but viable. Silas and Maria could draw attention through the alley, allowing Wade's diminished team to approach the critical target from an unexpected direction. Success depended on timing, accuracy, and the kind of reckless courage that separated heroes from casualties. "Give us 3 minutes," Silas replied, checking his Colts one final time. The assault began with Maria's rifle shot that shattered the bank's rear window, followed immediately by Silas's methodical elimination of 2 defenders, who exposed themselves to return fire. Their coordinated attack drew attention exactly as planned, allowing Wade's men to reach the external stairs without detection. Barnes's voice carried from the second-floor office, shouting orders to his remaining defenders while apparently attempting to destroy documents by burning them in a metal wastebasket. Smoke began seeping from the windows, confirming that evidence was being systematically eliminated. Silas made a decision that would have seemed impossible 20 years earlier. Instead of continuing the tactical game of position and counterposition, he walked directly toward the bank's front entrance, hands visible but ready, calling out in a voice that carried throughout the building, "Barnes, this is Silas McGraw. You want to settle accounts with the McGraw family. Here's your chance." The shooting stopped abruptly as defenders and attackers alike recognized the implications of the challenge. In a world where reputation still carried weight, certain confrontations transcended tactical considerations and became matters of personal honor. Barnes appeared at the second-floor window, his face flushed with anger and the smoke of burning documents. "McGraw, 20 years too late, but welcome to the party. Thomas is dead because of you," Silas called back. "That makes this personal." Thomas was an idealistic fool who didn't understand how the world really works, just like his brother apparently. The insult was calculated to provoke reckless action, but Silas had learned patience during his desert years. Instead of charging the building, he positioned himself where Barnes would have to expose himself to get a clear shot. The duel, when it came, lasted less than 3 seconds. Barnes appeared in the doorway with a rifle raised, but Silas's draw was faster and his aim more precise. The businessman's shot went wide, while Silas's bullet found its target with the accuracy that had made his reputation decades earlier. Barnes collapsed in the doorway, still alive but mortally wounded. Behind him, Sheriff Dulles attempted to continue the resistance, but Wade's team had reached the second floor and were methodically clearing the remaining defenders. In the sudden silence that followed the gunfire, Silas could hear the crackling of flames consuming documents that would never see a courtroom. Some evidence would survive, enough to expose the conspiracy's local connections, but the federal implications Thomas had died to reveal were disappearing in smoke and ash. Barnes looked up at him with eyes already glazing over. "You think this changes anything? The organization is bigger than one man, bigger than this territory. Kill me, and someone else takes over tomorrow." "Maybe," Silas replied, kneeling beside the dying man. "But they'll know what happens to people who murder lawmen. That might make them think twice." Barnes's last words were barely audible. "Ask your girlfriend about her real employers, McGraw. Ask her who really gives the orders." Then he was gone, taking his secrets with him to whatever judgment awaited corrupt souls in the territories beyond. Life. 3 weeks after the gunfight in Perido Springs, Silas sat beside his brother's grave in the town cemetery, watching the sun set over mountains that had witnessed countless such endings. The headstone was simple granite, bearing only Thomas's name, dates, and the words "Deputy United States Marshal." He served with honor. It was more recognition than many frontier lawmen received, and enough to mark his brother's dedication to ideals that had cost him everything. The official investigation had wrapped up quickly once federal prosecutors arrived with the surviving evidence. Judge Wickham, attempting to return from Santa Fe, had been arrested at the territorial border on charges of conspiracy and murder. Sheriff Dulles, wounded but alive, had agreed to testify against his former associates in exchange for a prison sentence rather than execution. The corruption network wasn't completely destroyed, but it was broken enough to prevent immediate reconstitution. Maria emerged from the town with a telegram in her hand, walking between the weathered headstones, with the careful step of someone who understood the weight of such places. She'd remained in Perido Springs after the battle, helping federal investigators piece together the full scope of Barnes's operations while wrestling with her own uncertain future. "News from Washington," she said, settling beside him on the stone bench someone had placed near Thomas's grave. Colonel Wade sends his regards and a commendation for services rendered to the United States government. Silas accepted the telegram without reading it, more interested in watching Maria's face than in official recognition from bureaucrats who measured success in political terms rather than personal cost. She looked tired but peaceful, as if some long-carried burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "What about the colonel's question?" he asked. During the aftermath of the gunfight, Wade had offered both of them positions within his intelligence organization. The work would be dangerous but meaningful, serving justice on a scale larger than personal vendettas or local corruption. For Maria, it represented a chance to continue the mission that had already consumed years of her life. For Silas, it offered purpose beyond the simple satisfaction of completed revenge. "I declined," Maria said simply. 20 years of living lies is enough for any lifetime. I want to try being honest for a while, see how that feels." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Boone had been exploring the cemetery's perimeter, but now returned to settle beside them with the patient acceptance that had characterized his approach to all of life's complications. "What will you do?" Silas asked eventually. "Stay here for now. The boarding house needs an owner, and I need a place where I can be myself rather than whatever the mission requires." She smiled slightly. "Strange to think that a place I've been pretending to live might become home." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Maria had maintained false identity in Perido Springs for so long that the pretense had become more real than the truth it was meant to conceal. Now she had the opportunity to transform deception into genuine belonging, if she could find the courage to trust in permanent attachments. "And you?" she asked. "Back to the desert?" Silas considered the question that had been troubling him since. Barnes's death. The mission was complete, justice served, and his brother's memory honored through direct action rather than legal proceedings. He could return to the wilderness he'd grown to love, resuming the peaceful existence that had sustained him for 20 years. But the man who would make that journey wouldn't be the same one who'd discovered Thomas's journal beside an ancient cactus. "The desert will always be there," he said finally, "but I think I've been hiding long enough." The admission surprised him even as he spoke it. For 2 decades, he'd convinced himself that his wilderness exile represented enlightened choice rather than extended cowardice. But facing Barnes and surviving the confrontation had reminded him that some problems couldn't be solved through patient withdrawal from the world of human complications. "Wade's offer stands," Maria observed. "He could use someone with your skills and knowledge of the territories. Maybe. Or maybe I'll try something different. Thomas believed the law could be more than just another kind of gun. Perhaps it's time I tested that theory." The possibility of wearing a badge himself, of serving justice through institutions rather than personal violence, felt both foreign and compelling. He was too old to start completely over, but not too old to try a different approach to the problems that had driven him into exile. As full darkness settled over the cemetery, they walked back toward town together, their shadows merging in the yellow light spilling from windows of houses where families gathered for evening meals. The simple domesticity of the scene stirred longings Silas had thought permanently buried beneath years of deliberate solitude. At the boarding house steps, they paused, suddenly aware that this moment represented a threshold that would determine the course of whatever remained of their lives. The past couldn't be changed, but the future remained unwritten, full of possibilities neither had dared imagine during their years of necessary deception. "I loved you," Maria said quietly. "Not because of orders or mission requirements, but because you were the first person I'd met who seemed to understand that strength and gentleness weren't contradictory qualities." "I know," Silas replied. "I figured that out when I read Thomas's journal. The question is what we do with that knowledge now." She smiled, the expression transforming her face into something younger and more hopeful than he'd seen since their reunion. We could try being honest with each other, see where that leads. Might be dangerous, he observed. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. That's what makes it worthwhile. Above them, stars appeared in the clear desert sky, the same constellations that had guided him through 20 years of solitary wandering. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, Silas McGraw wasn't alone under their ancient light. In the distance, Boone barked once at some night sound only he could hear, then settled into the comfortable silence of a dog whose master had finally found his way home.